All right, this is the end of the Korean War video for Ms. Richard's IB History of Americas. And this, you're going to need to buckle your seatbelt belts because this is going to be a long one. We're going to start in 1951 and end in 1954. So in the spring of 1951, the communist forces in the United Nations had dug in defensive positions right around the 38th parallel. And at this point in time, the war stopped moving. They might take a hill, come back, go back and forth, but they continued to fight all the way through 1951. By the time the international opinion had swung to the side of peace, even if it meant giving up the idea of a unified Korea, without U.S. Douglas MacArthur in command, the only strong voice in favor of the war to finish was South Korean President Syngman Rhee. General Douglas MacArthur was fired by Truman, which we will get into during class and do a simulation around that. The U.S. State Department began to search for contacts on the communist side to begin negotiations. Now, this was difficult, though. And this was difficult to do this because as the State Department is trying to do this, you are trying to make peace with basically a government in which, so finding negotiating parties was difficult because you were officially at war with North Korea, but in reality you need to negotiate with China, who doesn't officially exist according to you, and Russia, who officially has no role in the war. Furthermore, the American diplomats who had understood China had long ago lost their jobs and returned to the United States, having been accused themselves of being communists and communist sympathizers by McCarthy. On top of this, the United States was still deluded in its belief that the Soviet Union was in charge of all communist nations. And this is important because they go to the Soviets first, but really the Soviets have no official role here. And so it was difficult for them to find people to work with. Basically, the Soviet, eventually a former U.S. diplomat contacted the Soviet Union ambassador, UN ambassador Jacob A. Malik. And these two discussed the possibility of a ceasefire in Korea on June 23rd of 1951. Shortly after their second meeting, Malik surprised the State Department by broadcasting a message on UN radio. He stated that the Soviet people believed that a ceasefire and an armistice could be arranged between hostile nations. The Soviet Union insisted that it did not know China's intentions regarding a ceasefire and that the discussions would have to be between the United States and China. In a different conversation, the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyakov, suggested that the terms be reached if the parties focused on ending the battles and getting their armies out of Korea and left the future Korean government for later discussions. And this led General Ridgway, who was commanding the U.S. troops at this point after the removal of MacArthur. He got on U.S. Army radio and basically said that he suggested a meeting in the Danish hospital ship in Wonsan Harbor. On July 2nd, Peking radio broadcast from China a response signed by North Korean Premier Kim Il-sung and General Peng Deai, who was the commander of the Chinese troops in Korea, the volunteers. And you could definitely put quotation marks around that because there was nothing volunteer about it. Basically, they said, "We are authorized to tell you that we agree to suspend military activities and to hold peace negotiations, that our delegates will meet with yours, and we suggest in regard to the place for holding talks, that such talks should be held in Kaesong on the 38th parallel. If you agree with this, our delegates will be prepared to meet your delegates between July 10th and 15th in 1951. So, basically the peace talk began in Kaesong, and this is a drama-filled negotiations here. It was frosty from the beginning. There was no pleasantries exchanged. They didn't deal with it. The mood was cold and formal, and to begin with, heated up only with insults and arguments. At first, there were showdowns over little things, such as whose flag was more prominently displayed, who sat, whose chairs were higher than the others, who faced south, and all these really important things that they felt like they needed to discuss before they could begin talks. On the first day of talks, fully armed communist troops came through the area, pointing guns in a manner that felt threatening to the UN delegates. This was pretty much a move of aggression by the Chinese and the North Koreans. And so basically the U.S. said that we needed to change, and so they created a 5-mile circle around Kaesong where no troops could enter armed. The armed North Korean troops were banished from the zone where the talks were held, and foreign journalists were permitted in. These conclusions did not help the discussions. The negotiations spent the next 10 days, 10 sessions, arguing about items to be included on the agenda. So it took 10 meetings just to figure out the agenda for the official meeting. The 5 points listed for discussion, were that the July 26th negotiations compromised on the agenda, the location of the demilitarized zone around the 38th parallel, a ceasefire and armistice, POWs, which becomes the biggest issue on here, which you'd be pretty surprised. I think it surprised everyone. And then recommendations for governments, both the Korean governments, so that peace will last. It did not mention the UN demand that the International Red Cross and an international relief organization be allowed to inspect prison camps, or the Chinese demands that all foreign troops withdraw from Korea and that the demarcation line be set at the 38th parallel. Stymied. At the end of August 1951, the communists called off the talks. They claimed the UN aircraft had bombed the neutral zone at Kaesong, and the first claim of this was incorrect, but then it turns out later that a U.S. plane does go north and accidentally bomb Kaesong. General Ridgway apologizes, but they don't want to hear it. The communists don't want to accept that apology, and so it takes until later to resume the talks. On September 10th, another bombing occurred in Kaesong, and the United States again denied, but soon learned that one of their bombers had in fact accidentally bombed Kaesong, and General Ridgway apologized to the communist delegates, who rejected his apology. He threatened to stop the meetings entirely if the communists would not agree to hold them in a different location than Kaesong. He complained about how rude and just disrespectful the Chinese and the Korean delegates were. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Truman really tried to tell Ridgway, you can't put an ultimatum down on the Chinese or they will not come. So world opinion would not support the United States if it walked out on the peace talks. In the end, the Chinese compromised without being forced. In October, the meetings resumed at Punjam, a small village 6 miles east of Kaesong. But the fighting continued while this was happening. There were 2 extremely bloody battles, as you can see in these pictures. Although the terms were very different after the truce talks began, combat raged on as violently as ever. In the summer of 1951, a new form of battle became established. It was no longer large movements going many miles, but it was taking a ridge or taking a spot which would straighten out the lines or move just a few miles here and there. Bloody Ridge and Heartbreak Ridge came early in the truce period and set the model for many battles to come. Bloody Ridge started with a U.S. plan to straighten out the defensive line. This involved taking the northern ridge of the Punch Bowl, and this is where it was right here. And you can see, and not really well in this picture, but you can see it was bombed so heavily, and then the U.S. forces had to basically go in to very fortified, very strong holds and be able to remove them. On the next battle, which was Heartbreak Ridge, the United States had suffered 3,700 casualties, and the communist casualties were estimated at about 25,000. When these 2 battles were over, or this type of fighting continued, and from July to November in 1951, 60,000 UN casualties and 234,000 communist casualties. Now, the communist numbers are always a little bit in flux because they oftentimes were not reported correctly. You can look at documents, and anywhere from 159,000 to 400,000 Chinese troops died during the war. I think it's closer to the 400,000 number, but that is something that China has never really admitted to. The armistice finally came in 1952, but Rhee becomes a little bit of a problem. Here he is, Syngman Rhee. Rhee had his own agenda for a truce. And then he sent it to the U.S. Department State Department. Complete withdrawal of Chinese forces from Korea, disarmament of North Korea, UN commitment to prevent any third-party support of the North Koreans, South Korean participation in any UN consideration in any aspect of the Korean problem, and preservation of sovereignty, territorial integrity of Korea. In a July 16th letter to General Ridgway, signed by Rhee and 6 other Republic officials, he expressed his determination. The substance of the position of my government is that we cannot maintain our nation in half our country. A divided Korea is a ruined Korea, unstable economically, politically, and militarily. In every Korean heart, in every Korean mind, the fact is clear that our nation would be plunged into irrevocable disaster by any acceptance of a continued dividing line. This obviously created some problems. But as the negotiations went along, the demarcation line or demilitarized zone was established near the 38th parallel. Proceeding on the third agenda item, negotiators spent several weeks disputing the arrangements for a ceasefire and a supervisory organization to oversee it. After a good deal of compromising on both sides, all terms were arranged but one. And who thought that the last agenda item would take a year to solve? Almost 2 years. The armistice, the year of 1952, was an election year for the Republican, and they nominated Dwight D. Eisenhower Supreme Commander of the NATO forces in Europe during currently, and then during World War II was the Supreme Commander in Europe. Eisenhower returned home from Europe to campaign in June 1952, leaving his NATO command position open. I shall go to Korea, Eisenhower promised, to try and end the war quickly, and here you can see that he did show up in 1952. Eisenhower let it be known among the communist leaders that nuclear weapons would be considered if the peace talks were not resumed in this get-tough position. That is why MacArthur was fired. He wanted to drop atomic weapons on China, but Truman would not let that happen. They were fighting a limited war, which was a new concept where you don't go all out to win, but that you fight to get your objectives accomplished, and that's it. Obviously, the Truman administration, though, was not strong enough in its objectives because they crossed the 38th parallel, which obviously created a lot of problems, namely the entry of the nationalist Chinese army. So he let it be known, Eisenhower came into these, and he let it be known that nuclear weapons would be used. Eisenhower also removed an order issued by Truman in 1952 prohibiting nationalist China from taking military action in mainland communist China. Other than these gestures, the new president followed very closely to Truman's footsteps. But by nationalist China was the Chiang Kai-shek's forces in Taiwan. There's a big debate on whether to include them, have them come over and begin to fight China and go all out in a war with China. But by doing this, it definitely made the Chinese want to work harder. More changes in command on March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. Replacing him as the head of the Soviet Union was Malenkov, who promptly, after taking over, broadcasted a speech expressing the Soviet Union's desire for peace in Asia. Eisenhower responded favorably to Malenkhov's speech. The bombing, the North Korean food supply, the United States also took another step to force the Chinese and the North Koreans to accept the U.S. conditions on POWs, that they began to bomb the rice fields and poison the rice fields. They used those napalm bombs on the rice fields, basically wiping out the North Korean white rice crop, which was essential to feed North Korea. Now, the big debate was, what do we do with POWs? Obviously, the United States wanted their UN wanted their POWs back, and North Korea wanted their POWs back. The problem was that not a lot of North Korean POWs necessarily wanted to go back, and so the U.S. wanted to let North Korean POWs choose to go back to North Korea or to stay in South Korea. But the North Koreans and the Chinese did not want this, because the U.S. also wanted to let the Chinese choose POWs to choose whether they wanted to go back or not. Eisenhower sent a team to try to reason. So, on June 18th, Rhee ordered ROK officers at prison camps to release the prisoners. He did this with the help of some high-ranking American officers. That night, prison guards sent about 25,000 North Koreans out of the prison camp and into the population of South Korea. The UN delegates and General Clark immediately gave the North Koreans and Chinese a written apology for Rhee's actions. Obviously, this stopped the peace talks because all of a sudden now Rhee is letting all these prisoners roam free. But Eisenhower is continuing his threats of massive retaliation, of using the nuclear bomb as a way of saying that you will do this or we will drop it on you, because China and North Korea at this point do not have nuclear weapons. Eisenhower is criticized by many for not using nuclear warfare to bring a victory in Korea. And so Eisenhower sent a team to reason with Rhee. And so they basically had to make a promise to Rhee. On July 11th, with promises of enormous economic aid and continued presence of U.S. troops to provide security in South Korea, Rhee agreed not to obstruct the armistice. And so there we go. The U.S. now is out of the war, and Rhee agrees to this so that they are able to sign an armistice on July 27, 1953 at 10 p.m. Eisenhower is criticized for not using nuclear, and Truman were criticized for not using nuclear warfare to bring a victory in Korea. But for the rest of his life, Eisenhower remained proud of getting the United States out of a dangerous and miserable war, viewing it as one of the greatest accomplishments while in office. Operation Big Switch. They released the Neutral Nation Repatriation Commission, another 22,000 POWs who did not wish to be repatriated. And on these, 14,000 were Chinese and 7,900 were Koreans. The Repatriation Committee, headed by General Tomei of the Indian Army, heard the stories and decided the futures of the voluntary exiles, and in many cases sent them to live in neutral nations like Argentina, Brazil, and India. The Chinese who refused repatriation, however, were most often sent directly by the UN to Taiwan. And in this case, to give them freedom. So that's quite a few POWs that chose not to go back. The Pentagon estimate casualties for the war was 900,000 UN casualties. Of these, 850,000 were South Korean soldiers, 17,000 were non-American UN troops, and 150,000 were Americans. Of the casualties, 33,629 Americans were killed, and the rest were wounded. There was another 20,000 deaths within the military during the years of the Korean War, but not necessarily in Korea. Although a figure of 54,000 deaths, which included the deaths of people who did not die or necessarily serve in Korea, who had been used for many years, is engraved on the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. On the communist side, the Pentagon estimated 1,420,000 casualties. These were 520,000 North Korean and over 900,000 Chinese casualties. Some recent historians find these figures too high. You could bring those down quite a bit, but the Chinese definitely took large casualties at the beginning of the war when they came pouring over the border past the Yalu River. So both South Korea and North Korea remain. Kim Il-sung remains in control of North Korea until he gives it over to his son, Kim Jong-il, who has recently died and given it to his son. And so basically they went from being a communist government to a monarchy where it's passed down through people. There's very little known about, there's not as much known about North Korea, but we know that at the time of the war, they were pretty similar. Until the mid-1970s, believed that North Korea's gross national product was similar to South Korea. But South Korea took off in the 1970s, and through actually a military control of South Korea, they took off economically and became a major player in the economic world. But now they've gone back to a elected president who's actually under quite a bit of scrutiny for her role recently in some issues. But so that's the Korean War. That's the end of the Korean War, which was a very complicated, messy war. and first of what we call a limited war, where the objective is not to destroy the other side and to win an unconditional surrender, but to go as far as you deem you should, and set goals and then meet those goals. So this didn't turn out to be as long as I thought it might be. Maybe I talked too fast, but here we go. The video is complete. Please take notes and bring them to class so that we can use them to end our Korean War unit.